The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the UMass Extension Greenhouse Program Lunchtime webinar. Our speaker for the webinar is Douglas Cox, who is an associate professor with the University of Massachusetts, Stockbridge School of Agriculture. In this presentation, Doug is going to discuss the step-by-step protocol of using nature's source and sustained organic fertilizers to grow spring greenhouse crops. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type it on the question box. At the end of the webinar, Tina Smith, who is co-hosting this webinar with me, will read the questions and Doug will provide the answers. After the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete the survey before exiting the webinar. At this point, I'd like to pass the controls to Doug to continue with the webinar. Doug, it's all yours now.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, and welcome participants to the webinar on the day after the great storm. I guess most of us have shoveled out, but maybe not all of us. So I can't see you and you can't see me. I'm sure some of us have met in the past, so I'm trying to pretend that you're there, and most of you know that I work on fertilizers and soils and things here at UMass for greenhouses. Now, in today's webinar, I'm going to cover several categories of topics here. I'm going to cover the basic characteristics of nature's source fertilizer and then Sustane fertilizer. I don't get any money from these people, so all that I'm talking about here is my experiences with them in my little research projects. And so we're going to look at the basic characteristics and then mixing and application, which is kind of important in both types of fertilizers. And then kind of finish up with how to use the two fertilizers together to grow plants, and then a little bit on what you might expect or what you might not expect the results to be of using these two fertilizers. So I'm going to go to the next slide here, and let me see here. I'm not getting any movement. There we go. All right, sorry about that. So, so we're going to start off with nature's source here. If you're using this already, you're probably pretty familiar with these, some of these little factoids that I put up there. But this is a liquid fertilizer, and it's made from the extract of certain plants that produce, that are oils, classified as oil seed plants, maybe like soybeans or something like that. Some of the other liquid fertilizers, the competitors for nature's source, which you don't find too often, use beet extracts. So these are there's a classification of fertilizers that are called plant extracts, and so you're basically extracting the nitrogen and the phosphorus and so forth that the plant absorbed when it was growing in the field. This fertilizer is OMRI listed, so it's okay to use for organic growing. One of the nice things about this fertilizer is that the salt levels that are created in the soil when you use this fertilizer are generally lower than the ones that we would use with the chemical fertilizers. So there are less of the residues from this fertilizer that would be recognizable in a soluble salts test. It also makes it safer for your plants. I put two rates and things up here just for your own information, but one of the nice things about the nature's source is, and also Sustane, is that they have really nice labels on them which give you a lot of information. And I found that with other types of organic fertilizers, liquid and sometimes the solid ones, they don't really have the kinds of labels that we would like to have as the greenhouses. But you can't probably see it on the slide too well, but there's a list, there's a table on there that shows you how to dilute the fertilizer for different rates of nitrogen and with different types of injectors. So I have a 1:100 injector, and you could do the math yourself, and if you didn't have that type of injector. And then I had no injector, which means that you would be making these up at the final dilution, like in a 5-gallon bucket, depending upon, or whatever kind of container, depending on the size of your operation and the number of plants that you want to treat. So you don't really need the table, because you know, if you don't want 200 parts per million, you could do a proportion arithmetic there, and then get the answer that you want. So I think that's a pretty good thing. Now, one of the next, I think one of the more critical things about Nature Source probably is mixing and then applying the fertilizer, and what's going to happen when the fertilizer hits the water in your stock tank, and what's going to happen after that. Now, all liquid fertilizers that we have nowadays that are organic fertilizers, of course, they have organic nitrogen in them. I can't tell you exactly what the materials are that they're using in Nature Source, but in some of the others that I've looked at, they have a whole list of different types of amino acids which have nitrogen in them, and other types of nitrogen compounds in there. So some of these recommendations here would apply to other fertilizers as well. So the first thing that you would want to do, of course, would be to decide how much nitrogen that you want to apply. I've worked in the range of 200 to 250 parts per million for most of the common spring greenhouse crops that we have. One of the things that you need to do is agitate the concentration, shake it up, or however you can do this before you pour out the liquid and then dilute it to the, or put it in your stock solution to go from there. This stuff is kind of syrupy, so it's a little heavy at the bottom and a little lighter at the top, and I don't know exactly for sure how that affects the concentration of nitrogen and so forth that comes out of the container, but you really need to shake it up and make it as consistent a solution as possible. I think for those of you who have had experience with fish emulsion, you know it's sort of the same way. It's pretty heavy stuff and goopy at the bottom of the container that it comes in, and then the consistency of the container at the top is different. And I would think that this would influence the concentration of the fertilizer that you add. Now, all organic fertilizer, liquid organic fertilizers, are going to be subject to spoilage. And so if you've used these before, you're pretty well experienced all of the little islands of strange microorganisms and things that are floating around in the top of your tank. And then, of course, what goes along with that is a terrible smell that they have. Nature Source, before you put it in the water and let it set for a while, has a nice kind of beery, kind of alcoholic kind of smell, molasses smell, which I think is pretty pleasant. But when you get it into the water, then, and you dilute it, then the microorganisms that are all over your greenhouse are going to form their little colonies there, and that's because they're after that the amino acids and the other nitrogen compounds in there that they can use for their own nutrition. So they're very happy to enter your solution and cause the smell and the kind of gross mold that floats around on the surface. There aren't too many ways of doing this. There really aren't any ways to do this really well in preventing spoilage. But you know, you should really only mix enough of Nature Source to last about 3 or 4 days. You should either use it right away, or you should you know, use it within 3 or 4 days. Of course, if you come on the third or the fourth day and there's a whole bunch of stuff growing in there, then maybe the next time you need to do something different. I don't know this for sure, but I would think that the containers that you mix in need to be clean. They need to have a top on them and not be open, because according to the manufacturer's instructions, the microorganisms come from the air as well as maybe from the water supply that you have, and they don't talk anything about having a kind of a grimy container to put it in either. But you need to kind of protect it, and the more protected it can be and the sooner that you can use it, the less trouble you're going to have with smells and bad, ugly solution. Another point, the last one on this slide, is that you can use Nature's Source stock and inject it through a mist or an irrigation line if you wanted to. But keep in mind that a lot of irrigation lines, particularly the white plastic ones, are good breeding ground for the microorganisms, and they form a slime, a slime in there that's all different types of bacteria and algae and things in there that if you run water through that, it could contaminate your Nature's Source stock solution. The manufacturer suggests using an organically acceptable disinfectant or an OMRI listed one to treat your water with. And so I'm not an expert on this, but I think the best one in my estimation, and it is OMRI listed, would be Xerotol 2.0. You can use that at very low concentrations, and it's not going to hurt the plants, and it does a good job of controlling the microorganisms. If anyone has a different opinion on that, they can always put it into the form of a question, and maybe that'll help all of us learn about that. But for now, anyway, I think a disinfectant would be helpful at preventing the problem. Now we're going to move on to Nature's Source. So we got another slide here. I'm sorry, Sustane from, this is a granular, slow-release fertilizer that is made up of a number of different types of nutrient-containing materials or byproducts of the poultry industry. So turkey litter and feather meal are part of the pellets. And then also they are allowed by OMRI and other organic certifiers to use potassium sulfate to boost the potassium level. So this is a little bit richer fertilizer at an 844 analysis compared to the 311 of the Nature's Source. So this is a fertilizer that potentially would be helpful in supplementing Nature's Source, and maybe you wouldn't have to use quite so much Nature's Source that could be problematic for the plants. Either of these fertilizers, of course, can be used by themselves, but as I'm going to mention a little later on, I think the two of them together would be a good combination, and they each address the weaknesses and strengths of the other. So it has a 45-day release time, and the assumption there is that the temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use a pre-plant incorporation, and that's what I've done in my own work, or you can top dress that onto the surface. Now they have wonderful tables on their bag that talk about the different rates that you use. I don't know whether they have a little measuring cup that goes with this. They really need to, because to put the top dress on, if you wanted to do that, it's kind of fractions of a teaspoon full and that kind of thing, or something like 1.5 teaspoons would be required. They talk about grams, how many grams, but I don't think you're going to be measuring out 2 grams of fertilizer for 1,000 plants. And if you're going to treat them top dress, then you would probably want to do that with some kind of scoop, which you'll probably have to figure out yourself. what kind of a little scooper that you can use to apply that. Again, maybe somebody else has other ideas that we could hear. It's an OMRI listed material, and it has a low salt level. And again, I think the safest organic fertilizer and the most foolproof one for people who are just starting out with organic fertilizers would be the Sustane. Of course, this doesn't fit into everyone's program because not everyone is accustomed to using control-release fertilizers like Osmocote. But if you were doing Osmocote or something like that, then maybe you'd be more adaptable to using this particular one. But I feel like Sustane is probably the safest one and the most, probably the fewest problems for the various different plants that we have. Now we have another one here about mixing and applying Sustane, and the instructions here would be very similar to the types of instructions that we would have if you know, we were going to use Osmocote or one of the Nutricote or one of the other types of organic, not organic, but chemical control release of fertilizers. So the first thing would be that in a pre-plant mix, you need to find some kind of a way in your operation that you can apply fertilizer in a granular form and be reasonably certain that during the mixing process that you're going to evenly distribute the granules throughout the entire batch of soil that you're using. The rate that I used for my studies was basically a low rate based on the description of the types of plants that would be best for this. So it was 5.5 pounds per cubic yard, and so that would be what would be mixed in for most of the spring plants, or common bedding plants and things that you would use. But I think we all know that it's going to be kind of hard to incorporate this, but no harder than it would be for Osmocote or Nutricote or something like that. So they need to be evenly distributed. Then there are a couple of things, there's a couple of don'ts. You don't store the mix containing Sustane for more than 2 weeks. And it should be a fairly dry mix when you do, if you do want to hold it for 2 weeks, because once it comes in contact with water, then it will begin releasing the nutrients and breaking down into the soil. And then, of course, the third point on there is that you would not steam sterilize the mix when you use Sustane. Probably wouldn't be a good idea to put mix containing Sustane in some place in your greenhouse that gets hot either, because that wouldn't be good. A lot of people don't have steam sterilizing anymore anyway, but you might have hot places in the greenhouse, a boiler room or something, that wouldn't be a good place to put it. Now, then we come down to the fourth point there is that it is possible that the nutrients in Sustane could become depleted before the 45 days arrives. And I have observed this a number of times in my own work, that the Sustane plants are going along really well. They're the equivalent in appearance and growth to the chemical fertilizer like Plantex. And all of a sudden they seem to like hit a wall, and they begin to turn a little pale, and they slow down, and the chemical fertilizer ones kind of get ahead of them in terms of growth. And that's a sign that they're not getting enough nutrition at that particular point in time. So I don't have answers for you here, other than the fact that, you know, you can combine the Sustane with well, some other fertilizer, but here it would be Nature's Source. The reason for the depletion could be due to heavy watering, which would be a characteristic of your own business, and it wouldn't be something I could address directly. If you use the porous mix, maybe you'd lose some of the nutrition that way, especially when you combine it with the heavy watering. And also maybe if the temperatures in the greenhouse got above 70 degrees, that might affect the temperature of the growing medium enough so that it would enhance, increase the release of nutrients from them. So the one way possible of getting around this is to use a higher rate, but of course with a control release fertilizer, once you put it in there, you can't make any changes unless you want to top dress them all. But in a succeeding crop, you could use more, or you could combine with Sustane with Nature's Source and get the benefits of both of the organic fertilizers at the same time, and not run into the nutrient deficiency problem. The manufacturer's instructions do address this slightly. They do mention that maybe it's sort of implying that maybe you should use a water-soluble fertilizer to enhance the Sustane later in the season. So those are the rules on mixing and applying Sustane. And then the next slide here shows really, maybe you came today and expected I was going to talk the entire time on how to combine the two of them together, and there was all sorts of difficult things to do there, but there really aren't. Basically, I would recommend that whenever you use organic fertilizers, at least the ones that we have nowadays, is that you consider trying to make a pair of them somehow, you know, 2 organic fertilizers rather than relying on just one. For example, with Nature's Source, they're a little short compared to the other fertilizers that we used to on nutrients in general, but particularly phosphorus and potassium. So wouldn't it be a good idea to have another partner fertilizer, I guess you'd say, in this that had either at least more phosphorus and potassium and maybe some more nitrogen to try to make up for the difference. On the other hand, you know, the Sustane, as I mentioned, the release time is 45 days, but it could run out before 45 days, and then you'd have your liquid fertilizer there to supplement the application of the Sustane. And we've done in the industry, this has been done in the past with the chemical water-soluble fertilizers and things like Osmocote and Nutricote. When the fertilizers were a little bit more popular, that people would pair them up together with a liquid fertilizer and a controlled release fertilizer. So basically, this is what I did. The last little statement there is what I did in my experiments. I made a a pre-plant application of Sustane at 5.5 pounds per cubic yard, and then I began applying Nature's Source shortly after planting at somewhere between 200 and 250 parts per million, depending on what I thought was best for the plants that I was testing at the time. I would not, with Nature's Source, go above 250 parts per million without doing some trials first, because the ammonium levels might get a little bit too high for some of our plants to tolerate above 250 parts per million. And so I started fertilizing with Nature's Source almost, you know, right immediately after planting, to make sure that there was going to be enough nutrition for the seedlings to get going. But another approach to this would be maybe you could hold off on the Nature's Source and after planting, and maybe start in at about 25 to 30 days after planting, with the expectation that perhaps the the Sustane is going to run out of nutrition, and so that you're already addressing that potential problem by using the liquid fertilizer, not necessarily at the beginning, but certainly close to the point where close to the 45-day point, and I think that would work better. I have to say that with Sustane, I was always impressed by how well the plants did up to a certain point, and then after that point, then they really fell behind the other plants with other types of treatments. And it was only because, as far as I can tell, that the fertilizer ran out. Now, I did mention earlier in my talk that both Nature's Source and Sustane had good labels on their bags and their containers. The Sustane label has many other rates that you could choose for yourself based on a cubic yard, or unfortunately in terms of grams for top dress, so you'd have to do some experimentation there to figure out how to do that. So you know that one way, I think I've already mentioned this, of overcoming the problem of to some extent would be to you know, raise the rate of the fertilizer. Still only going to last 45 days, but you'll have introduced more nutrients into the soil mix, and maybe the plants will have taken up enough so that they can go on longer without supplement from something else. Now, I do have pictures in here. I don't have many pictures. I only have 2 slides with pictures on them, but this is some of the responses that I've had to fertilizers. The Plantex would be the control, the chemical fertilizer. Then you have Nature's Source to its right, Sustane farther over, and Nature's Source and Sustane together at the end. Don't be fooled. Don't think that just because the Sustane ones look a little shorter there that that's necessarily exactly how it's going to come out. I think on general, when I took dry weights and measured them and all of that, that the Sustane itself by itself and the Nature's Source plus Sustane were about the same as the Plantex and the Nature's Source individually. And you don't see any nutrient deficiency symptoms there, and the flowering is okay, and pretty similar for the marigolds. These are First Lady marigolds, and this is kind of typical of how things turn out with the really common type of bedding plants. Now, the next picture that I have here shows you a group of plants that got either Plantex chemical fertilizer at 200 parts per million, and they would be the plants with the blue labels, and then the ones with the red tape on the labels would have got 200 parts per million at the same frequency of application with Nature's Source. Now, the interesting thing is here, okay, the pansies in the top left, they look fine. The marigolds, they always turn out good. The dianthus down in the right-hand corner, at least at the point that they are in their development, are pretty equivalent to one another and don't seem to have any problems. But then, unfortunately, you look over here at the Plantex versus Nature's Source, and the Nature's Source one on the right there with the bluish flowers is very pale, almost to the point of white. That's generally a tip-off that the plant may have iron deficiency symptoms. One thing that I wish we knew better about the organic fertilizers is just how much of elements other than nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that they contain. The Nature's Source, I believe, said that they had like magnesium and calcium in there, and iron they'd mentioned as well, but you know, how much iron and compared to other types of fertilizers, and how much calcium and how much magnesium, it really isn't on the label. So I don't know whether this particular example with the petunia was a mistake that I made, or just a one-off, but we know that petunias are heavy feeders. We know that petunias are susceptible to iron deficiency. The pH was a little too high, but not very great. Maybe it was like the 5.8 or something like that with the Nature's Source, but it was about the same with the Plantex too. So I think what you're going to do, I mean, petunias and calibrachoas are among the most popular of the annuals that we have today. If you're going to want to do use these fertilizers on those plants, you need to do some trials first on this to see how things turn out under your conditions, and see how they work. Now, I don't have another picture of this, but seed geraniums. Seed geraniums with Nature's Source alone often develop interveinal chlorosis, which could either be potentially, depending on who you are, suggest either nitrogen deficiency, magnesium deficiency, or iron deficiency, or maybe soluble salts injury. Well, in the study that I did, none of those, when I analyzed the tissue of the plants, none of those was at a deficiency level or even close to a deficiency level. But one thing that was odd and was not good was that the leaves with interveinal chlorosis had a lot of ammonium in there. So we don't normally analyze leaves for their ammonium content, but I have a very simple test that I can do on them to see how much ammonium is in there. And they had, the Nature's Source fertilizer had a significantly higher level of ammonium in the tissue than the other various other treatments that I did. So, okay, what does that tell us? That tells us that maybe you got to go easy on Nature's Source with Nature's Source. I mean, yeah, with Nature's Source, and then if probably you would want to use the technique of using part of the nitrogen coming from Sustane and the other portion of it coming from Nature's Source. So maybe try to rely more on the Sustane, and then maybe toward the end of the growth period come back and hit the plants with some liquid fertilizers before they're ready for sale. Excuse me. So I have some final tips here. I strongly believe that the combining organic fertilizers together is the best. I have done work with a number of different types, liquid and granular types, and I really think the outcome was always the best with the Nature's Source and the Sustane. Oh, in extension talks all the time, whether we're talking about pesticides or fungicides or whatever we're talking about, or fertilizers, we always suggest that you do a trial first before applying it to all your plants. So I would definitely recommend that you do some trials on your own with the plants under your own conditions to see how Sustane and Nature's Source or any of the other fertilizers that you choose to try turn out in the end. Now, the other thing is that one of the things that I feel fairly safe about these is that the best probably use for organic fertilizers is for short-term crops of less than 6 weeks of duration. So these might be vegetable transplants. And I think that, you could go with either Sustane or Nature's Source by themselves. And as long as you kept it down around the 200 parts per million level, I think you'd be pretty safe doing that, although you could combine the two of them together. The other thing to keep in mind is that how the plants respond to the fertilizers may have something to do with the time of year. So if you're growing plants in the January, February, early March season, when they may not grow too fast, or the greenhouse is cool, or they don't if you water them, water doesn't evaporate very fast. You've got to be a little bit more careful with the organic fertilizers at that time than you would later on when you get into late March, April, and May, when the plants are really growing fast and they really need nutrition. And I think the results always turn out better with the organic fertilizers in the warmer part of the spring growing season than they do back at the earlier parts in January or February. So I lost track of time here, but I think it's 12:30 at least, and I'm going to turn this back to Jeffrey and Tina, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Doug. So I just have one quick question because we're really out of time. Is what growing media did you use that was successful with both of these?
Basically, I've used soilless media, either Fafford 3B or the ProMix BX or the Fafford mix that's like 3B, but it doesn't have, that's the organic mix, which doesn't have the starter charge and the wetting agent in it.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question is there a shelf life to these products? Is there an actual expiration date, or can you store them as long as they're stored cool?
The Sustane is pretty stable as long as it doesn't get moist, okay? And I don't think being in a hot location is going to hurt that one, but if it, you know, it needs to be kept dry. The Nature Source, as long as it's stored at room temperature, is okay and pretty stable also, based on my own experiences with the fertilizer.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much, Doug. And Jeffrey, you had one more thing?
Yeah, it looks like you don't have any questions from the audience.
I just asked just 2 questions.
Yeah.
No, that's it. So we're done.
Yeah, so the only thing that I also wanted to ask Doug to clarify is that on one of his slides, he showed Sustane at 311 instead of 844.
Oh, did it? Oh yeah, darn it!
Yeah.
This one here that we're looking. You can see this now.
Yeah.
Mixing and applying Sustane, that should have had 844. That's a typo. Sorry.
I just wanted you to clarify that so that we avoid any confusion. So otherwise, thank you all for attending the webinar, and please complete the short survey before you exit, and have a good afternoon, and see you on the next webinar. Goodbye for now.
All right. See you later.